Good evening and welcome. Tonight I want to take you somewhere cold, somewhere quiet, somewhere where the snow falls so thick and so heavy that the world outside simply disappears. Imagine a train, a long, elegant train, cutting through the heart of the Alps on a bitter winter night. The year is 1952. The carriages are warm, the lamps are low, and somewhere in first class, a man is about to die. His name is Edmund Villiers, a diamond tycoon, a powerful man, a man with many enemies, and very few friends. By morning he will be dead, stabbed in a locked compartment, on a train that has not stopped once through the night, and the only man who can untangle this web of secrets, silence, and snow is a small, rather peculiar Belgian gentleman by the name of Hercule Poirot. This is the midnight train to Zurich, a story of isolation, of revenge long waited, and of three people who shared one terrible secret and one very sharp knife. If you enjoy mysteries told the old way, slow, deliberate, and full of shadows, then stay with me. The train is leaving, all aboard. The train, the night, the man. The snow had been falling since early afternoon. By the time the Orient Express, or rather the private Alpine Transit, train number 7 from Milan to Zurich, departed from the station at Domodossola, the platform was already buried under 6 inches of white. The porters moved quickly, their breath coming out in little clouds, their boots crunching with each step. Passengers climbed aboard with the particular relief of people escaping something. The cold. Yes, but perhaps other things too. Hercule Poirot stood on the platform for a moment longer than necessary. He was not a man who liked snow. He had said this many times to many people, and yet here he was, in the Alps, in December, on a train that would spend the better part of the night climbing through passes that made even experienced travellers grip their armrests. He pulled his coat tighter, adjusted the muffler around his neck, and sighed the sigh of a man who has accepted his fate with dignity, if not enthusiasm. "Monsieur Poirot?" A young porter appeared at his elbow. "Your compartment is ready, sir. Number 6, first class." "Merci." Poirot handed the boy his small travelling case and followed him up the steps. Inside, the train was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something faintly floral. A woman's perfume, already drifting through the corridor. The lamps along the walls cast a soft amber light. The carpet was deep red, slightly worn at the centre where 1,000 feet had walked before. Poirot approved. There was something honest about where. It meant the place had lived. He found his compartment, settled himself into the window seat, and watched the platform disappear as the train pulled away into the dark. The other passengers, Poirot would later reflect, were exactly the sort of collection one finds on a night train through the mountains. That is to say, they were all, in their own particular way, hiding something. He observed them at dinner. The dining car was perhaps the most civilized room on the train. White tablecloths, silver cutlery, a waiter named Georges, who moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned that passengers do not like to be reminded they are on a moving vehicle. Poirot sat at a table for 2 near the window, ordered the soup, and watched. At the far end of the car sat Edmund Villiers. Poirot had heard of Villiers, of course. Most people in certain circles had. He was a large man, not tall exactly, but broad, the kind of broadness that comes not from strength, but from years of good dinners and better wine. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair swept back from a wide forehead, and a face that had once been handsome, and now simply looked expensive. He wore a dark suit, a gold watch chain that caught the light whenever he moved, and the expression of a man who expects the world to arrange itself according to his preferences. He was dining alone. This seemed to suit him perfectly. Across the aisle sat a woman Poirot placed at around 40, perhaps a year or 2 either side. She had dark hair pinned up with a simplicity that was almost certainly not simple at all, and grey eyes that moved around the dining car with a quiet, careful attention. She wore a dark green dress. No jewellery except a single ring on her right hand. Not the left, Poirot noted. She had ordered fish and was eating it without apparent pleasure, as though food were merely a requirement she was fulfilling. Her name, Poirot would later learn, was Mrs. Helena Marsh. Behind her, sharing a table and apparently sharing very little else, sat 2 men who had the uncomfortable air of people who know each other better than they wish to admit. The first was younger, late 30s perhaps, with the kind of face that had probably been called boyish once and now simply looked unfinished. Fair hair, restless hands, a habit of glancing at the door. His name was Mr. Robert Calder. The The second man was older and darker in every sense. Black hair going grey at the temples, deep-set eyes, a stillness about him that Poirot found more interesting than any amount of movement. He ate slowly and said almost nothing to his companion. His name, and according to the passenger list Poirot had, quite casually, quite innocently, glanced at before dinner, was Dr. Franz Heller, a doctor. Poirot found that interesting too. There were other passengers, a young honeymoon couple who were entirely absorbed in each other and could safely be dismissed from suspicion on the grounds that they had clearly forgotten the rest of the world existed. An elderly Swiss gentleman named Monsieur Brown, who was already asleep over his bread roll, and a thin, nervous woman of indeterminate age who had ordered tea and drunk it in 3 rapid swallows and then ordered another. Poirot ate his soup. He listened to the sound of the train, the rhythm of it, the particular music of wheels on track that changes subtly as the elevation rises. Outside the window there was nothing to see, only snow pressing against the glass like something trying to get in. It was after dinner, perhaps 9 o'clock, when Poirot first had cause to notice the tension between Villiers and the others. He had stepped into the corridor to stretch his legs. His knees did not appreciate long periods of sitting, a fact he found personally offensive, and was making his slow way toward the far end of the carriage when he heard voices from behind the door of compartment 3. He did not, of course, stop and listen deliberately. He simply paused to adjust his muffler, which happened to take a moment. "Told you this would happen." A woman's voice, low, controlled, but with something underneath it, something that had been controlled for a long time. A man's voice, quieter, the words lost under the sound of the train. Then the woman again. He knows. He has always known. The question is what he intends to... The voices stopped. Someone had become aware, perhaps, of the particular quality of silence that exists just outside a closed door when someone is standing on the other side of it. Poirot moved on. He returned to his compartment, sat down, and looked at the snow against the window for a long time. 3 people, he thought. Mrs. Marsh, Mr. Calder, Dr. Heller, and the victim. Because yes, he is thinking of Villiers as the victim already, which is either remarkable intuition or remarkable presumption, and he has learned over the years not to worry too much about which. He opened his book. He read perhaps 4 pages without absorbing a single word. Then he put the book down, and folded his hands over it, and allowed his little grey cells to begin their quiet, methodical work. Outside, the Alps rose invisible in the dark, and the snow came down, and the train climbed on. Edmund Villiers, at that same hour, was sitting in his private compartment. Compartment One, the largest on the train, which he had reserved and paid for in a manner that suggested he considered money a perfectly adequate substitute for charm, and he was writing a letter. He wrote slowly, with a heavy fountain pen pressing hard enough into the paper that the words would have been legible from the other side had anyone been holding it up to the light, which, as it happened, no one was. The letter was addressed to a solicitor in London. It concerned, among other things, a woman named Helena Marsh. Villiers finished the letter, folded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of his compartment, which was cream-coloured and faintly yellowed at the edges, and he thought the particular thoughts of a man who believes himself to be entirely in control of a situation. He poured himself a small brandy from the bottle on the narrow shelf above the wash-basin. He drank it standing up. Then he sat back down, loosened his collar slightly and closed his eyes. He did not, it should be noted, lock his compartment door. This was either carelessness or confidence. And Poirot would consider this possibility later, turning it over carefully in his mind like a stone that might have something interesting underneath. It was an invitation. The train entered the first mountain tunnel at 20 minutes past 9. For exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, there was nothing outside the windows but darkness and the roar of enclosed air. Passengers looked up from their books, their conversations, their private thoughts. The sound was different in a tunnel, louder, more immediate, the train suddenly aware of its own noise. Then they were through, and the snow returned, and the mountains stood on either side like enormous sleeping animals. In the dining car, Georgia cleared the last of the tables and turned the lamps down slightly. In compartment 6, Hercule Poirot finally, deliberately set aside his book, turned off his reading lamp, and lay down with his hands folded on his chest. He did not sleep, he thought. And somewhere in the quiet first-class carriage, 3 people who shared a secret sat with that secret in the dark, and the train moved on through the snow, and the night was still very young. The body in Compartment One. It was the conductor who found him. His name was Henri Lemaire, and he had been working night trains for 11 years, and in 11 years he had seen a great many things. Passengers taken ill, passengers taken drunk. One memorable occasion involving a small dog that should not have been on the train at all and very much knew it. But he had never, in 11 years, opened a compartment door and found what he found at 37 minutes past 11 on that particular December night. He stood in the doorway for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Then he stepped back into the corridor, pulled the door carefully shut behind him, and stood very still with his hand still on the door handle, breathing through his nose, the way a man breathes when he's trying to convince himself that he is calm. He was not calm. He walked to the end of the carriage. He walked back. He stood outside Compartment One again. He opened the door again, just a few inches, just enough to confirm that he had seen what he had seen, and that it had not rearranged itself into something less terrible in the intervening 30 seconds. It had not. Edmund Villiers was sitting in the chair by the window. The same chair, Poirot would later establish, where he had been sitting when he poured his brandy. He was leaning slightly to the left, his head tilted at an angle that no living person maintains for long. His right hand had fallen open on the armrest, the fingers loosely curled, as though he had been holding something and had simply let it go. There was blood. Not a great deal. Less than Henri Lemaire would have expected, which somehow made it worse rather than better. A dark stain on the left side of Villiers' jacket just below the ribs, already dried at the edges. The brandy glass was on the floor, unbroken. It had rolled to the far corner of the compartment and sat there, catching the light from the corridor. Henri Lemaire closed the door a second time. Then he went to wake the train's senior officer, a man named Capitaine Devereux, and after that, because Devereux was practical if nothing else, they went to wake Hercule Poirot. Poirot was not asleep. He was lying precisely as he had been for the past 2 hours, hands folded, eyes open, the particular stillness of a man whose body has stopped moving so that his mind can move more freely. When the knock came at his door, he said "Entrez," without sitting up, which startled Henri Lemaire considerably. "Monsieur Poirot?" Devereux was a tall man, angular, with a grey moustache that he clearly felt compensated for a great deal. He stood in the doorway with the careful posture of someone who has decided that dignity is the appropriate response to all situations. "I apologize for disturbing you at this hour. There has been an incident. A death," Poirot said. Devereux blinked. "Yes. How did you... You would not come to me at this hour for anything less." Poirot sat up, smoothed his moustaches with 2 careful fingers, and reached for his dressing gown. "Compartment One, I think. Monsieur Villiers." The 2 men in the doorway exchanged a glance that Poirot found quietly satisfying. "Yes," said Devereux again. "Give me 2 minutes," Poirot said. "And then take me to him." The corridor was empty when they walked through it. The train was still moving. Poirot noticed this, registered it, filed it. Still climbing through the mountain dark, the snow audible against the windows now in a way it had not been earlier, a soft persistent sound like someone brushing the glass with a cloth. Devereux unlocked Compartment One with a master key. The 3 of them went in. Henri Lemaire stayed by the door, which Poirot thought showed good instincts. Contaminate as little as possible, even if the man didn't know that was what he was thinking. Poirot stood just inside the doorway for a long moment and looked. He looked at Villiers. He looked at the chair, the angle of the body, the position of the hands. He looked at the brandy glass in the corner, noted that it was unbroken, thought about what that meant, filed it. He looked at the narrow shelf above the wash basin. He looked at the window. The window was closed, latched from the inside. The door, when Henri Lemaire had first arrived, had been unlocked. "Touch nothing," Poirot said, though neither man had moved. He stepped carefully into the room, crouching slightly. His knees made a sound he chose to ignore, and examined the wound without touching it. One entry point, left side below the ribs, angled slightly upward. A narrow blade. Something, he searched for the word, deliberate. This was not a wound made in panic or in struggle. There was no sign of struggle at all, actually. The compartment was as tidy as it had been when Villiers occupied it. Nothing overturned, nothing displaced except the brandy glass, and the brandy glass told its own small story. It had not been thrown or knocked in a fight. It had simply fallen from a relaxing hand. Villiers had not seen it coming. Or, and here Poirot paused, looking at the face, which wore an expression of nothing very much at all. He had seen it coming and had not been surprised. The train, Poirot said, straightening up slowly. "It must be stopped." "We're approaching the Simplon Pass," Devereux said. "To stop on the pass in this weather." "To continue," Poirot said pleasantly, "would mean arriving in Zurich with a murderer, who will then walk off the train and become a person who was never on it. So," he looked at Devereux with his large, mild eyes, "the train must be stopped. At the nearest station or in the open, it makes no great difference. But it must be stopped, and the passengers must be woken, and no one, Capitaine, must be permitted to leave." Devereux looked at him for a moment. Then he gave a short, reluctant nod and went to speak to the driver. They stopped at a small unmanned halt called, according to the rusted sign barely visible through the snow, Pontebella. It was nothing really. A platform of cracked concrete, a wooden shelter with 3 of its 4 walls intact, a single lamp on a post that cast a weak orange circle in the dark. Beyond it, on all sides, the mountains and the snow and the absolute pressing silence of a winter night at altitude. The train sat in this silence and hissed steam. In the first-class carriage, doors began to open. Poirot stood in the corridor and watched them emerge, one by one, blinking, pulling dressing gowns tight, faces carrying the particular confusion of people woken from sleep and told something incomprehensible. The honeymoon couple appeared together, the young woman's hair loose, the young man's hand already at her elbow. Monsieur Brown emerged, looking remarkably composed for someone who had been asleep since 7. The nervous woman with the tea appeared in a thick wool robe, already wringing her hands. And then, the 3. Mrs. Helena Marsh came out of compartment 3. She was fully dressed. Poirot noted this. He noted it very carefully and did not allow his face to show that he had noted it. Mr. Robert Calder came out of compartment 4. He was in pyjamas and a robe, his fair hair disordered, his eyes moving quickly up and down the corridor with an alertness that did not quite match the costume of a man recently woken. Dr. Franz Heller came last from compartment 5. He was dressed like Mrs. Marsh, but where her composure was careful and deliberate, his was the composure of a man who's working very hard to maintain it. He stood in the doorway of his compartment and looked at the other passengers, and then, for just a moment, his eyes found Mrs. Marsh's. Something passed between them. It was brief. It was almost nothing. If Poirot had blinked at that precise instant, he would have missed it entirely. He did not blink. Devereux addressed the passengers in the corridor, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who is in charge of a situation he does not understand. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that a passenger has been found dead in his compartment. I must ask you all to remain on the train until—" "Dead?" The nervous woman's voice, sharp, higher than expected. "I'm afraid so." "Which passenger?" A pause. "Monsieur Villiers, in compartment 1. The corridor received this information in various ways. The honeymoon couple looked at each other. Monsieur Braun made a small sound and shook his head. The nervous woman pressed both hands to her mouth. Mrs. Helena Marsh stood very still. Her face showed nothing. Nothing at all. And Poirot, who had seen grief, shock, guilt, relief, and every gradation between them register on human faces for more years than he cared to count, found that blankness more interesting than any expression she might have worn. Robert Calder said, "Good God," in a tone that Poirot could not quite read. It was either genuine shock or a very practiced version of the same thing, and the problem was that both sounded identical. Dr. Heller said nothing. He looked at the floor. His hands were at his sides, perfectly still. Poirot watched all 3 of them and thought, "Yes, it is these 3. I was right before dinner, and I am right now. The question is not who. The question is why, and in what arrangement, and what it was that Villiers did that brought these 3 people onto the same train on the same winter night. And underneath that question, quieter, a small and stubborn instinct, the letter in his inside pocket. Where is the letter now? He had seen Villiers write it. He had not seen him send it. He would need to look. By midnight, the snow had thickened to the point where the platform at Pontebella had disappeared entirely beneath it, and the single orange lamp on its post had become little more than a glow in the white dark, present but unreachable, like something half-remembered. Inside the train, the passengers had been sent back to their compartments, with instructions to lock their doors and wait. Poirot returned to compartment 1. He stood over Villiers for a second time and thought, with a feeling he recognised as something close to sorrow, not for the man exactly, because he had not known the man, and what little he had observed had not been entirely prepossessing, but for the general fact of it. A man alive at dinner, dead before midnight. Whatever he had done, whatever arrangements he'd made, whatever letters he had written, all of it ended here, in a small compartment on a stopped train, in the snow, in the dark. Poirot reached carefully into the inside pocket of Villiers' jacket. His fingers found the pocket. He felt the smooth lining of the jacket, the hard edge of a pen, and there was a slight crinkle of nothing. The pocket was empty. Poirot stood up slowly. He looked at the pocket. He looked at the body. He looked at the room with its closed window and its unlocked door and its unbroken brandy glass in the corner. So, he thought, the letter is gone, which means whoever came in here tonight knew about the letter, or found it by chance, and took it. He stood in the middle of the compartment for a long moment, quite still, the train silent around him, assessed, or the snow pressing at the glass. This is going to be, Hercule Poirot thought, with something that was not entirely displeasure, a very long night. The art of listening Poirot began with the woman. This was not, as some might have assumed, a matter of gallantry. It was a matter of strategy. In his experience, and his experience was considerable, accumulated over more decades than he generally chose to advertise, women who had been fully dressed at midnight on a stopped train in a snowstorm were women who had something very specific on their minds. And women with something specific on their minds were, paradoxically, both harder and easier to interview than men. Harder, because they were more careful with words. Easier, because they could not always control what their hands did, or their eyes, or the particular quality of silence that fell between one sentence and the next. He knocked on the door of compartment 3 at 12:15. "Come in," said Mrs. Helena Marsh, as though she had been expecting him. She probably had. She was sitting in the window seat, the same position Poirot favoured in his own compartment, which he noted without particular significance. The lamp above her was on, casting her face in warm light that was nonetheless not flattering, because it was the kind of light that reveals rather than softens. She had her hands folded in her lap, the dark green dress from dinner, the single ring on the right hand. She looked at Poirot with those grey eyes and waited. "Madame Marsh," Poirot said, and was settling himself into the seat across from her with the careful movements of a man who is buying himself a moment. "I am sorry to disturb you at such an hour." "You're not disturbing me," she said. "I was not sleeping." "No," Poirot agreed. "I did not think you were." A small pause, outside the snow. "You were dressed," Poirot said. "When Capitaine Devereux made his announcement, you were fully dressed, at nearly midnight." She looked at him without any change of expression. "I sleep poorly on trains." "Ah." Poirot nodded slowly, as though this were entirely satisfactory. It was not. "And Monsieur Villiers, you knew him?" "Something, brief, there and gone." "I knew of him," she said, "by reputation." "His reputation in what, if I may ask, particular area? Business?" The word came out flat, precise, like a door being closed quietly but firmly. Poirot tilted his head slightly. "He was in diamonds." "I believe, yes. A successful man, by some measures." Poirot looked at her for a moment. She met his gaze without difficulty, which itself told him something. Not guilt necessarily, but practice. This was a woman who had been looked at carefully before and had learned to look back. "Madame," he said, and his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. Less conversational, more direct. "I will tell you something. Because I think you are an intelligent woman, and I find that intelligent people respond better to honesty than to, how shall I say, the slow approach." He paused. "I believe that you knew Edmund Villiers, not of him, not by reputation. I believe you knew him personally, and I believe that knowledge is connected to why you're on this train tonight." The silence that followed was perhaps 5 seconds long. It felt longer. "That," Mrs. Marsh said carefully, "is a significant accusation." "It is not an accusation," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is an observation. I make many observations. Most of them are correct. Occasionally—" He gave a small, self-deprecating wave of one hand. "I am wrong. It happens. Not often, but it happens. So please, if I am wrong, tell me, and we will proceed differently." She looked at him. He looked at her. "What do you want to know?" she said at last. What she told him came out slowly in pieces. The way a person tells something they have not told anyone for a very long time. Not fluently, not in a straight line, but circling, approaching, retreating, coming back. Her name was Helena Marsh, born Helena Voss in Vienna, 1912. She had come to England in 1936 with her husband, a professor of economics named Charles Marsh, and their daughter, a girl of 7 named Anna. In 1947, Charles Marsh had invested the majority of his savings. Their savings, she was careful to say. Their savings in a diamond trading company. A company run at that time by a man named Edmund Villiers. The company had failed, or rather, and here Mrs. Marsh's voice flattened in a way that Poirot found very telling, the company had been arranged to fail. The investors had lost everything. Villiers had not. He was never charged, she said. There was an investigation. It went nowhere. He had lawyers, very good lawyers. A pause. He had other things too, I think. People in certain positions. I never knew exactly how it was managed, only that it was. And your husband? Poirot asked gently. She looked at the window, at the snow. Charles died in 1949, she said. His heart. Another pause, smaller this time. I have always believed, I know one cannot prove such things, but I have always believed that what happened with the money, the loss, the humiliation of it, the way it took everything from him, not just the financial, she stopped and started again. He was not the same man afterward, and then he was gone. Poirot said nothing for a moment. I am sorry, he said, and meant it. She acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head. I didn't come on this train to kill Edmund Villiers, Monsieur Poirot. I want to be clear about that. Then why did you come? She looked at him directly. Because I received a letter 3 weeks ago, telling me that Villiers would be on this train, and that there was documentation. Evidence of what he did in 1947. Evidence that had been kept carefully for years. I was told that if I came, I could have it, that it could be used finally to... She stopped again. This time the pause had something different in it. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the reconsideration of something she had been certain of until quite recently. To? Poirot prompted. To expose him, she said. Publicly, legally if possible, to make it known what he was, what he did. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Who sent you this letter? I don't know, she said. It was unsigned. And you came anyway. Yes. Poirot looked at her. He believed her, which was interesting because he had not expected to believe her, and he had learned to pay attention when he believed people he had not expected to believe. It usually meant something. One more question, he said, rising slowly from the seat. The gentlemen in compartments 4 and 5, Mr. Calder and Dr. Heller. Do you know them? The pause this time was very short, barely a pause at all. No, she said. Poirot nodded. Thank you, madame. You have been most helpful. He was at the door when she said quietly, Monsieur Poirot. He turned. Whatever he did, she said, whoever killed him, I did not. I want you to know that. I know, said Poirot. He went out into the corridor and stood for a moment thinking. She is lying about Calder and Heller, he thought. About everything else. I think she told the truth, but about those two, she knows them. The question is how much, and since when, and in what capacity, and the unsigned letter. Who arranges a meeting on a train? Who draws 3 people? Because he is quite sure now, all 3 received letters, onto the same train as their enemy. He moved down the corridor toward compartment 4. Robert Calder answered the door on the second knock, and stood in it like a man who cannot decide whether to let someone in or not, and has run out of time to make the decision. Monsieur Poirot, he said. Mr. Calder. Poirot smiled pleasantly. May I come in? Calder stepped back. The compartment was in mild disorder. The bedding on the bunk had been pulled back, and then not entirely straightened, suggesting someone who had been in bed, gotten up, and not bothered to maintain the pretense of having stayed there. A jacket was draped over the back of the seat. On the small fold-down table, a glass with a finger of whisky in it, and beside the glass, Poirot's eyes moved to it and away again, casually, the way a cat looks at a bird it has already decided about, a folded piece of paper. Calder sat down. He picked up the whisky glass, seemed to think better of drinking from it, and set it down again. His hands, Poirot noticed, were not entirely steady. Terrible business, Calder said. Villiers, was it? He was killed, Poirot said simply. Yes. God. Calder rubbed his face with one hand. Do you know who? That is what I am attempting to establish. Poirot settled himself comfortably. You knew Monsieur Villiers, Mr. Calder? A beat. I'd met him a few times, business circles. What sort of business are you in? Finance, investments mostly. He said this with a slight flatness that Poirot recognised as the tone of a man describing something he no longer feels good about. "And your investments," Poirot said mildly. "Did they ever intersect with Monsieur Villiers' enterprises?" The word enterprises sat in the air between them for a moment. Calder looked at his whiskey. "There was a company," he said. "Years ago. I lost money. A lot of people lost money." 1947, Poirot said. Calder looked up sharply. "You know about that." "I am learning about it," Poirot said, which was not quite the same thing, but close enough for the moment. Calder was quiet. Then, "He ruined people, not just financially. I had a partner. We'd invested together, a friend of mine since university. When it all collapsed, Calder stopped. His jaw tightened. "He took his own life, 6 months after the company went under." Poirot was still. "I'm sorry," he said. The same words he had said to Mrs. Marsh, the same meaning behind them. "I didn't come here to kill him either," Calder said, and there was something almost angry in it, a frustration at having to say the thing. "I want to be clear. I received a letter, unsigned," Poirot said. Calder stared at him. "Yes. How did you—" "Go on." "It said Villiers would be on this train. That there was evidence, proper documented evidence, of what he'd done in 47. Fraud, manipulation. I don't know exactly the legal. I'm not a lawyer. But it said the evidence existed and that I could have it." He paused. "So I came." "And the paper on the table," Poirot said. "Is that the letter?" Calder hesitated for just a moment too long. "Yes," Poirot nodded slowly. He did not ask to see it. He simply noted the hesitation, folded it away in his mind and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Calder. One last thing. Dr. Heller. Do you know him?" Calder's eyes went to the wall that was, on the other side, Compartment 5. "No," he said. The same lie, Poirot thought, walking away. Exactly the same lie, said in almost exactly the same way. Dr. Franz Heller opened his compartment door before Poirot knocked, and he had been standing just inside it, apparently waiting. This struck Poirot as either very guilty or very forthcoming, and he had not yet decided which. "Monsieur Poirot," Heller said. His English was precise and lightly accented, German, Poirot thought, or Austrian. "I expected you sooner." "I work in a particular order," Poirot said pleasantly, coming in. Heller's compartment was the tidiest of the three. Everything in its place, bag stowed, jacket hung. The bunk made with a precision that suggested habit rather than effort. A medical bag sat on the floor beside the bunk, black leather, worn at the corners. On the fold-down table, nothing. Not a glass, not a paper, not a book. Heller sat. He was composed in a way that was different from Mrs. Marsh's composure. Hers had been maintained carefully against something. His was simply there, like a natural feature of him, and it made him harder to read. "You were a doctor in Vienna?" Poirot asked. "And settling in?" A slight pause. "I was, before the war, after I moved, several times." He said this without elaboration and without apparent invitation for further questions on the subject, which of course meant Poirot stored it as something to return to. "And Villiers," Poirot said. "You knew him?" "I knew what he did," Heller said. "Not I knew of him, not by reputation. What he did." The distinction was small and significant. "In 1947, Poirot said. Heller looked at him with those dark, still eyes. "You're well informed." "I am becoming so," Poirot paused. "What did he do to you, Doctor?" Heller was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, perhaps too even, the way a voice is when it has recited something many times in private and learned to say it without breaking. "I had a sister," he said, "younger than me by 4 years. She came to London in 1946. She'd survived a great deal during the war, and London was a new beginning. She worked, she saved, she invested what she had," a pause, "everything she had, with Villiers' company, in 1947. "And lost it," Poirot said. "Lost it? Yes." Another pause. She did not recover. Not from this, on top of everything else. She had been strong for so long, and then this. Such a small thing in one sense. Money. Only money. His voice was perfectly flat. "She died in 1950. I will not say more about how." The compartment was very quiet. "I received an unsigned letter," Heller said, before Poirot could ask, "telling me Villiers would be on this train. That evidence of what he did could be mine, that I could finally do something." He looked at Poirot. "I am a doctor. I have spent my life trying to repair things, to fix what is broken. And this man," he stopped, his hands flat on his knees pressed down slightly. "I came for the evidence, that is all." Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "Of course," he said softly. He rose, thanked Hella, and went out. In the corridor he stood for a full minute, not moving. 3 people, 3 letters, unsigned. 3 losses, all tracing back to the same man, the same year, the same crime, and that crime's architect now dead in his compartment with an empty pocket where a letter had been. Someone, Poirot thought, arranged this very carefully. Someone drew these 3 people here, onto this train, into this snow, and gave them all a reason. And then someone killed Villiers. But which of the 3 pulled the trigger? The knife, rather, and which 2 only thought about it? Or, said a quieter thought, settling in like snow, did all 3 of them go in, one after another, and did each of them do their small part so that no single person bears the whole weight of it? He looked at the closed door of Compartment One. He looked at the snow against the window at the end of the corridor, thick, relentless, indifferent. Tomorrow, he thought. The little grey cells will have more to say tomorrow. He went back to his compartment, lay down, folded his hands, and this time eventually he slept. What the snow keeps. He found it in the morning. Not early morning, not the sharp, purposeful kind of morning that arrives with clear light and resolved intentions. This was the grey, reluctant morning of a train that has spent the night stopped in a snowstorm. When the world outside is the same impenetrable white, it was at midnight, and the lamps inside still feel necessary, and the distinction between night and day is more a matter of the clock than of any actual change in the quality of the dark. Poirot woke at 6, dressed with his usual care. He did not believe that difficult circumstances excused a man from the obligation of appearing presentable, and in fact held the private opinion that difficult circumstances made it more important, not less, and went first to the dining car where Georges had produced coffee and bread with the quiet heroism of a man determined to maintain standards regardless of what was happening around him. Poirot drank his coffee and thought. He thought about 3 letters, unsigned, sent to 3 different people with 3 different addresses, all containing essentially the same information. Villiers, this train, this date, the promise of evidence. Someone had known all 3 of them, or known their connection to Villiers, known their addresses, known their capacity for, he chose the word carefully, motivation. Someone had constructed this situation. The question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the previous night, patient and unhurried, now moved forward. What if the killer is not one of the 3? He turned the thought over, examined it, set it aside, not dismissed but held in reserve. The way one sets aside a piece of a puzzle that doesn't fit yet but clearly belongs to the picture. He drank the rest of his coffee and went to look at the dining car more carefully. It was Georges who gave him the first real thing. Not intentionally. Georges was not the sort of man who offered information. He was the sort of man who brought food and cleared plates and existed in that particular professional invisibility that good service requires. But Poirot had long ago learned that invisible people see everything, and he had a gift developed over many years for asking questions in a way that felt like conversation. "Last night," Poirot said, accepting a second cup of coffee with a small, grateful nod. "You were working until late, I imagine. The dining car. When did you finish for the evening?" Georges considered. "I cleared the last table perhaps 10:15. Turned the lamps down. Went to my quarters at the rear of the train around 10:30. And between 10 and 10:30, was anyone still in the dining car? 1 person, yes." Georges refilled his own water glass unnecessarily, the small fidget of a man accessing a memory. The doctor, the dark one, quiet. He sat at the corner table for perhaps 20 minutes after the others had gone. He had a brandy. He was writing something, I think, or reading. I didn't look closely. "Of course not," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "And he left. At what time would you say?" 10:20 perhaps. 10:25. Poirot nodded. "Thank you, Georges. The bread is excellent." Georges accepted this with a slight bow and withdrew. Poirot sat with his coffee and thought about Dr. Franz Heller, alone in the dining car at 10:20, writing or reading something, 37 minutes before Henry Lemaire found a dead man in Compartment One. He went next to the corridor. This was something he should have done the previous night and had not. An oversight he acknowledged to himself with the mild irritation of a man who expects better from himself, and occasionally, being human, does not get it. The corridor between the compartments was narrow, carpeted in the same deep red as the rest of the carriage, and it had one quality that was immediately relevant. The carpet was thick enough to hold an impression. Not footprints exactly. The carpet was too dense and too well trodden for that. But near the door of Compartment One, where the carpet met the threshold, there was a patch that was different, slightly compressed in a way that suggested more than one person had stood there, close together, within a short span of time. And on the brass door handle of Compartment One, Poirot leaned in, careful not to touch. There were smudges. The handle had been wiped. Not thoroughly, not professionally, but wiped. The way a person wipes something quickly in the dark when they are frightened and in a hurry. Not one set of smudges. He counted, as best he could, which was imperfectly, at least 2 distinct patterns of wiping. 2 different moments, possibly 2 different hands. He stood up. So, he thought, at least 2 of them went in, possibly all 3, and at least 2 of them were frightened enough afterward to wipe the handle, but none of them frightened enough to actually lock the door, which suggests they all left very quickly and none of them thought to... He stopped. He looked at the door handle again. Or, said the quieter thought, they left the door unlocked on purpose, so that Lemaire would find him quickly, so that the train would stop in the mountains and no one could leave and the matter would be contained. He considered this. That, he thought, would suggest a level of premeditation that is either very impressive or very troubling, or most likely both. By 9 o'clock, as the snow had eased enough that a pale, diffuse light was making its way through the carriage windows. Not sunlight exactly, more the suggestion of it, filtered through clouds so thick they might have been solid. But it changed the quality of the morning, made it feel less like the inside of something sealed. Poirot gathered the 3 of them in the dining car. He did this through Devereux, who delivered the request with the manner of a man who has accepted that he is not, in any practical sense, in charge of this situation, and is finding a kind of relief in that acceptance. The 3 passengers came in one by one. Mrs. Marsh first, then Calder, then Heller, and sat at the same long table where they had eaten dinner the previous evening, which Poirot suspected was not comfortable for any of them. He stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He found, in moments like this, that standing gave him a slight advantage, not of height, because he was not a tall man, and harboured no illusions about it, but of attention. People look at a standing person differently than a sitting one. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I will not take more of your time than is necessary. I have spent the morning thinking, and I have some questions. I would ask that you answer them honestly, because I will tell you now that I have, let us say, a reasonable idea of what happened last night. And it will go better for everyone if what you tell me matches what I already know, rather than creating additional complications." He looked at each of them in turn. Mrs. Marsh met his gaze. Calder looked at the table. Heller looked at Poirot steadily, with those dark, careful eyes. "You 3, Poirot said. "You know each other." Silence. "I will not ask you to confirm it," Poirot continued pleasantly. "I am telling you, you know each other. You came onto this train knowing the others would be here. The letters you received, unsigned, yes, but not, I think, entirely unexpected. Because somewhere, before this train, before this week, you had already made contact, found each other. The people who had all been wronged by the same man." A long pause. Mrs. Marsh was the one who spoke first. "Yes," she said, quietly, without drama. Calder's head came up. He looked at her. Something passed between them, not the brief and coded look of the previous night, but something more resigned. More like 2 people acknowledging that the game has reached its natural end. "Yes," Calder said. Heller said nothing for a moment, then simply, "Yes." The story came out over the next 40 minutes, and it was, as stories of this kind often are, both more complicated and more human than Poirot had expected. They had found each other through a solicitor. Not Villiers' solicitor, a different one. A small firm in Holborn that specialised in what the senior partner carefully called complex financial irregularities. Each of the 3 had, independently and at different times, approached this firm about the 1947 collapse. And the solicitor, a quiet, thorough man named Mr. Addison, who apparently had very strong feelings about people who used legal structures to rob ordinary investors, had, with their permission, put them in contact with each other. That had been in 1951. For the past year, the 3 of them had been, not friends exactly, Mrs. Marsh said, but something. Correspondents. People united by a specific shared experience. They had exchanged letters. They had met twice in London in a Holborn tea room and discussed what options existed. There were very few options. Villiers had covered his tracks with professional thoroughness. The paper trail was thin, carefully constructed to be thin. Without additional evidence, documented evidence, like the kind that would stand up to scrutiny, there was nothing to be done. "And then the letters came," Poirot said. "And then the letters came," Mrs. Marsh agreed. "All three of you received them." "Within a week of each other," Calder said. "Same information, same train, same promise. But unsigned." "Yes." Poirot looked at them. "And you discussed it. Before the train. You knew the others had received letters too." A pause. "We wrote to each other," Heller said. "When we each received the letter, we confirmed that we had all been invited. And you decided to come anyway, together but separately. Separate compartments, no acknowledgement of knowing each other. It seemed," Calder stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "It seemed safer to not appear connected, in case it was, in case Villiers had arranged it somehow, some kind of trap." "A reasonable concern," Poirot said. Then, or after a pause, "though it does create a difficulty for you now." None of them responded to that. "The evidence," Poirot said, "the promised documentation, did any of you receive it? Before last night or during?" They looked at each other. "No," Mrs. Marsh said slowly. "I received nothing. I assumed it would be delivered on the train, that whoever sent the letters would make themselves known. And they did not." "No." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and walked slowly to the window. The snow outside had stopped completely now. He noticed this, found it significant in no particular way except that it changed the feeling of the morning, made the world outside look cleared and cold and still. "I want to ask you each," he said, without turning from the window, "where you were between 10 o'clock and midnight last night." The silence had a different texture this time. "I was in my compartment," Mrs. Marsh said, "from approximately 9:30. I did not leave it until Devereux's announcement. You did not visit Compartment One." "No." Poirot turned. He looked at her. "You are certain?" Something flickered. "I walked past it," she said after a moment. "Once, perhaps at 10:30. I could not sleep. I walked to the end of the corridor and back." A pause. "I stopped outside his compartment. For a moment. She stopped. "I did not go in." "But you thought about it?" She looked at him steadily. I thought about it," she said. "Yes." Poirot nodded, as though this were entirely expected, which it was. He looked at Calder. "I also was in my compartment," Calder said, and his voice had the careful tone of a man constructing a sentence while he speaks it. "From after dinner. I also walked the corridor at some point. I don't know exactly when, 11 perhaps." "And did you also stop outside Compartment One?" A long pause. "Yes," Calder said. "And did you go in?" The pause this time was different. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to lie, but the pause of someone deciding how much of the truth to give. "The door was open," he said finally. "Slightly. I pushed it. I looked in." He stopped. "He was already dead when I looked in. I swear to you, he was already dead. I didn't touch him. I didn't go in properly. I saw him, and I pulled the door shut, and I went back to my compartment. And you told no one." "I didn't know what to." Calder stopped, pressed his lips together. "No, I told no one." Poirot held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Heller. Heller met his eyes. "I was in the dining car until 10:20, he said. "Georges can confirm that." "He already has," Poirot said. Heller absorbed this without visible reaction. "After that I returned to my compartment. I did not walk the corridor. I did not go near Compartment One." "You are certain?" "I am certain." Poirot looked at him for a long moment. Heller did not look away, did not shift, did not perform the small unconscious movements of a man being less than truthful. He simply looked back, steady and still, and Poirot found him, as he had found him the previous night, the most difficult of the three to read. Which was itself, of course, a kind of information. He let them go after that. He stood alone in the dining car for a few minutes, looking at the 3 empty chairs, the 3 cups of coffee that Georges had brought and that had gone largely undrunk. One of them is lying, he thought. Possibly 2. Possibly all 3, in different proportions and about different things. Calder saw the body at 11. Lemaire found it at 11:37. Either Villiers was killed between 10:20, when Heller left the dining car, and 11, when Calder looked in. Or Calder is lying about the body already being dead when he entered, and Mrs. Marsh stood outside the door at 10:30 and did not go in, or says she did not go in. He rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers, a gesture he rarely made, and which indicated, had anyone been watching, a degree of genuine frustration. And the letter, he thought, still missing, taken from Villiers' pocket by someone who went into that compartment and came close enough to reach inside his jacket. He looked at the table. Then, quite suddenly, he thought of something he had not thought of before. He thought of the unsigned letters, 3 of them, sent to 3 different addresses, containing the same information. And he thought, who else received a letter? Was there a 4th? A 5th? Is there someone else on this train whose connection to Villiers I have not yet found? He stood up straight. He thought about the nervous woman with the tea, the one who had ordered 2 cups in rapid succession and sat alone and had appeared when the announcement was made, not confused as the others had been, but, what was the word? Not confused. Prepared. The 4th letter. Her name was Miss Vera Ooten. Poirot found this out from the passenger list, which Devereux produced with the slightly defeated air of a man who has stopped asking questions about why things are being requested and has simply begun providing them. Miss Vera Ooten, age 44, travelling from Milan to Zurich, compartment 7, no listed occupation. No listed occupation was, in Poirot's experience, either entirely innocent, a woman of independent means, a retired person, someone between things, or the opposite of innocent. The absence of a category was itself a category. He knocked on the door of compartment 7 at 10:30. No answer. He knocked again. "One moment," said a voice from inside, thin, slightly breathless, the voice he recognised from the corridor announcement the previous night. A pause that was slightly too long. Then the door opened. Miss Vera Houghton was small and thin in the way that suggested she had once been merely thin, and was now, with age and something else, worry perhaps, or a prolonged effort of some kind, becoming smaller. She had brown hair going grey at the temples, reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and the kind of eyes that are permanently slightly wide, as though the world keeps presenting them with things they were not entirely prepared for. She was holding a book, and she had clearly just picked it up. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I wondered when you would come." Which was, Poirot reflected, the second time in 2 days that someone had said a version of that to him. He was not sure whether to find it flattering or concerning. "May I come in?" he said. The compartment was interesting, not untidy exactly, but lived in a way that the others had not been. A second bag, smaller than the first, tucked under the bunk with slightly too much care. A coat hung on the hook behind the door with something heavy in one of its pockets. Poirot's eyes moved to it once, briefly, and away. On the fold-down table, alongside the not very convincingly deployed book, a small leather document case closed with a brass clasp. Poirot sat down. He looked at Miss Houghton. She sat across from him with her hands folded and her wide eyes steady and weighted, in the manner of someone who has rehearsed this moment. "You knew Edmund Villiers," Poirot said. Not a question. "Yes," she said, immediately. No pause, no flicker. This was different from the 3. Their yeses had come after hesitation, after the calculation of cost. Hers came out cleanly, like something she'd been waiting to say. "For how long?" 20 years, she said, more or less. Poirot looked at her. In what capacity? Miss Houghton unfolded her hands and then folded them again, a small restless movement she seemed unaware of. "I worked for him," she said, "from 1932 to 1947. As a secretary initially. Later, in a broader capacity, I managed correspondence, schedules, certain financial, administrative matters." She paused. "I knew where everything was, every document, every file, every—" She stopped. "I knew a great deal about how he operated." "Including the 1947 scheme," Poirot said. "I knew everything about the 1947 scheme," she said quietly. "I processed the paperwork. I filed the documents. Her voice flattened. "I did what I was told, Monsieur Poirot. For 15 years I did what I was told, because I was afraid of him, and because I needed the work, and because I told myself that I didn't fully understand what I was doing, which was—" She stopped. "Which was a lie I told myself because the truth was too uncomfortable." The compartment was very quiet. "In 1947, she continued, "when the company collapsed and the investors lost their money, I saw what happened to some of them. Not all. I didn't know all of them personally, but some. A woman who came to the office. Helena Marsh, though I didn't know her name then, who sat in the waiting room for 4 hours trying to see Villiers, and was told each time that he was unavailable. A pause. A young man, Robert Calder, who sent letter after letter that I myself typed the refusals to. Politely worded refusals. I typed them. I posted them. Poirot said nothing. And others, she said. Many others. And I kept working there until 1948, when Villiers dissolved the company properly and let me go with a reference and a small severance. And I took both and said nothing and tried to... She looked at her folded hands. Tried to live with it. But you could not, Poirot said softly. I could not, she agreed. Not entirely. It took me several years to decide what to do about that. And then I decided... She reached across the table and opened the leather document case. Inside were papers. Not a few papers. Many. Perhaps 40 or 50 pages, some typed, some handwritten, some appearing to be carbon copies of documents that existed somewhere else in originals. Poirot did not touch them. He looked at them, at the headers, the dates, the figures visible on the top pages, and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing clicking into place. "This is the evidence," he said. "This is the evidence," Miss Houghton said. 15 years of documentation. Correspondence between Villiers and the men who helped him structure the fraud. Internal memos describing the plan explicitly, not in legal language designed to obscure, but in plain terms, because he trusted the people he wrote them to, and he never imagined anyone would keep copies. A pause. I kept copies of everything. For 15 years, whenever there was something that troubled me, something I knew was wrong, I made a copy and I kept it. Why? Poirot asked. And then, more gently, forgive me. I mean, why did you keep them in those years, before you had decided what to do with them? What was the purpose in the beginning? Miss Houghton considered this for a moment. I think, she said slowly, it was the only way I could feel that I wasn't entirely complicit, that some part of me was refusing, even if the rest of me was going along. The copies were a small rebellion, the only one I was capable of at the time. Poirot nodded. He understood this, and he had seen it before. The small private refusals that people make when they cannot make the large public ones, and the way those small refusals can become, over years, something else entirely. You sent the letters, he said, to Mrs. Marsh, to Mr. Calder, to Dr. Heller. Yes. Why those three specifically? Because I knew their names, she said simply, from the files. I knew what Villiers had done to each of them specifically, not just in financial terms, but the consequences. The human consequences, she paused. I knew about Mrs. Marsh's husband, about Mr. Calder's partner, about Dr. Heller's sister. Her voice for the first time wavered slightly. I had watched Villiers destroy those three people's lives from the inside of his office, processing the paperwork, and I knew their names, and I thought, these are the people who deserve to see this evidence, who deserve to know that it exists, that what was done to them is provable, real. Not just their word against his. Poirot was quiet for a moment. You chose this train, he said. I knew his travel schedule, I always had. Old habit. A ghost of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, not quite bitterness. He was going to Zurich for a business meeting. I booked my ticket. I sent the letters telling the others which train. I intended to approach them, to give them the documents, to let them decide what to do with them. And Villiers himself, Poirot said carefully. Did you intend to approach him as well? A pause. I intended to confront him, she said. Yes, to tell him that the evidence existed, that it was being given to people who would use it. She looked at Poirot. I wanted him to know, before it happened. I wanted to see his face when he understood that he was not untouchable, that he had never been untouchable, that the thing he thought he had managed perfectly safely was not managed at all. And did you? Poirot asked. Confront him? Miss Houghton looked at the document case. I went to his compartment, she said, at 10 o'clock, before dinner had properly finished. He was there. I told him who I was. He recognized me, though it took a moment, it had been several years, and I told him what I had, what I intended to do with it. His reaction? He laughed, she said. The words came out flat, almost without inflection, but underneath them something old and cold. He laughed, and told me that documents were only as useful as the lawyers presenting them, and that his lawyers were considerably better than anything I could afford, and that if I attempted to use any of it, he would see me in court for theft of proprietary documents and have me destroyed. A pause. He used that word, destroyed. And then I left, she said. So I took my documents and I left his compartment and I went back to mine and I sat with the door locked for an hour trying to... She stopped. Trying to decide if I had made a terrible mistake. Coming here. All of it. She looked at Poirot. And then the announcement came, she said. And he was dead. Poirot sat with this for a moment. The document case sat on the table between them. Outside the window, the Alps in pale winter light. Visible now, finally. The snow stopped and the sky a thin, cold blue. The mountains enormous and indifferent and very beautiful. Miss Houghton, Poirot said. The letter, the one Villiers was writing at dinner. Do you know anything about it? She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, but the particular look of someone who was not expecting a specific question and is now recalibrating. A letter, she said. He was writing it at dinner. It was in his inside pocket when I last saw him. It was gone when I checked this morning. Miss Houghton was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of the coat hanging behind the door. She placed a folded letter on the table beside the document case. Poirot looked at it. He did not touch it yet. You took it from his pocket, he said. When I was in his compartment, she said, at 10 o'clock. He had already written it. It was on the table, not in his pocket yet. He picked it up while we were talking and put it in his jacket. I think to make a point of it, to show me he was already taking steps. A pause. When I left, I took it from the table. There was another copy, the one in his pocket. I took the table copy. I didn't know he'd already pocketed the original. But someone else took the original, Poirot said, from his pocket, after he was dead. She said nothing. Poirot unfolded the letter. It was addressed to a solicitor in London, as he had expected. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph instructed the solicitor to begin proceedings against a Miss Vera Houghton for the theft of proprietary documents and to apply for an injunction preventing the use or distribution of said documents. The second paragraph was shorter. It read, Additionally, please be advised that I have reason to believe certain parties, specifically a Mrs. H. Marsh, a Mr. R. Calder, and a Dr. F. Heller, are conspiring against my interest with the above-named individual. I wish to discuss appropriate measures at your earliest convenience. Poirot folded the letter, set it down. He knew, Poirot thought. He knew about all 4 of them. He had perhaps known for some time. The question is whether any of them knew that he knew. He looked at Miss Houghton. When you left his compartment at 10 o'clock, he said, was he alive? Yes, she said, very much so. And the door, when you left? I pulled it shut, she said. I don't know if it latched. I was not entirely composed. Poirot nodded slowly. He picked up the letter. He picked up the document case, looked at Miss Houghton for permission, received a slight nod, and looked through the top few pages carefully without disturbing the order. It was exactly what she had described. Meticulous, specific, damning. The kind of evidence that good lawyers could certainly challenge but could not make disappear. He set it down. Miss Houghton, he said, I want to be clear about something. What you have here, this evidence, it has value, real value. Not merely emotional value, though that is also real. Legal value, the kind that does not evaporate simply because one man with expensive lawyers has died. He paused. In fact, his death may complicate the use of it in some respects, but it does not destroy it. Do you understand? She looked at him with her wide, tired eyes. I think so. Good. He stood. I'm going to ask you to remain in your compartment for a little while longer, and to keep that case with you. You don't think I killed him? She said. It was not quite a question. Poirot considered. You had the most knowledge of his activities, he said carefully. You had access to him at 10 o'clock, which establishes opportunity. You had considerable motivation, he paused. And yet, you also had a plan, a coherent, long-developed plan that required Villiers to be alive and exposed, not dead, and therefore beyond legal consequence. A dead Villiers is considerably less useful to your plan than a living prosecuted one. Another pause. So no, I do not think you killed him. But I think you know more about who did than you have told me. Miss Houghton looked at the window. The corridor, she said after a moment. When I came back from his compartment, at 10 o'clock, perhaps 5 past, there was someone in the corridor. Poirot went very still. Who? I didn't see clearly, she said. The lamps are low at night, and I told you, I was not composed. Someone at the far end near the window, standing still. A pause. I believe it was a man. but I couldn't say with certainty. Standing still, Poirot repeated. Not walking, standing. Yes, as though waiting for something. Poirot stood in the middle of the compartment for a moment, thinking. A man, and standing still in the corridor at 10 o'clock while Miss Houghton was inside Compartment One confronting Villiers, waiting. Heller had left the dining car at 10:20. Calder claimed to have been in his compartment from after dinner. Mrs. Marsh had walked the corridor at 10:30. But someone was there at 10 o'clock, Poirot thought, before any of them claimed to have been, standing in the corridor, waiting for Miss Houghton to leave. He looked at the door. He thought about the smudges on the door handle. 2 sets, 2 different moments, 2 different people who had wiped it. Not one killer, nervous and quick. 2 people who had both touched that handle and both thought to clean their traces. 2, he thought, not 3, 2, and then... But the wound, one wound, deliberate, precisely placed. Not the wound of someone in a rage or in a panic. The wound of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out. He had been thinking, since the previous night, that perhaps all 3 had participated. 1 blow each, the burden shared, no single hand bearing the full weight of it. He had been thinking of the story of the train, that other case, the one everyone knew. But this was not that case. This was different. One person killed him, Poirot thought. One person made the decision and carried it out, and one other person came in afterward, or perhaps just before, and knows what happened, and has said nothing. He turned back to Miss Houghton. "Thank you," he said. "You have been very helpful. More helpful, I think, than you realise." She looked at him with those wide eyes. "Will it, the evidence, will it still matter, now that he's dead?" Poirot picked up his hat from the seat beside him. He looked at it for a moment. "Justice," he said, "takes many forms, Miss Houghton. His death does not end the story. There are others, the men who helped him structure the fraud, who are still alive, still operating. The evidence does not become irrelevant because one man is gone. If anything," he paused, "if anything, his absence may make certain things easier." He put on his hat. "Preserve the documents carefully. You will be asked about them again by people with more legal authority than I possess." He went to the door. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. He turned for the second time in 2 days at a compartment door. "The person in the corridor," she said. "The one I saw waiting. I think..." She stopped, started again. "I think they had been waiting for a long time, not just that night. Years." Poirot looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think so too." He went out. In the corridor, he stood for a moment and looked at the door of Compartment One at the far end. Then he looked at the window. The mountains outside, massive and white and ancient, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in the warm interior of a stopped train. One killer, he thought, and one person who knows. He knew which of the 3 had been standing in that corridor. He was almost certain he knew which of the 3 had gone through that door. He needed one more conversation. What the grey cells know. He went to find Heller, not because he was certain. He wanted to be precise about this, even in his own mind, because certainty arrived too quickly was a thing he had learned to distrust. He had been certain before in his long career and had been wrong, and the memory of those occasions sat with him always, quiet and instructive. But he was close to certain, close enough that the remaining distance felt like a formality rather than a genuine unknown. Doctor. Boo. Franz Heller was in his compartment. He answered the door immediately, as he had the previous night, and stood aside to let Poirot in without being asked, which itself confirmed something. A man who has decided that the moment has come stops performing the small hesitations of innocence. There is a particular kind of readiness that looks, from the outside, very much like calm. Poirot came in, he sat down. He did not speak immediately. The mountains were visible through Heller's window, closer here it seemed than from the other compartments, though this was almost certainly not true, just the angle. The light on the snow was that particular white gold of late morning in the Alps, clean and cold and very clear. "You were in the corridor," Poirot said, "at 10 o'clock, perhaps 10 past. Heller looked at him. "Yes," he said. Poirot nodded slowly. He had expected the yes. The yes was almost a relief, not because it made things simpler exactly, but because it meant the conversation could be honest, and honest conversations, in his experience, were always preferable to the alternative, even when they were difficult. "You saw Miss Houghton leave his compartment." "I didn't know who she was then," Heller said. "I know now. I've thought about it since. and I believe I've seen her face before, in a photograph years ago. But at the time, no. A woman leaving his compartment. That was all. And you waited until she'd gone. Yes. And then you went in. A pause. Not long. Yes. The story Helle told was quiet and precise, the way his voice was always quiet and precise, and it had the particular quality of something that has been carried for a long time and is now finally being set down. He had not planned it on the train. This was the first thing he said, and Poirot believed it. And because planned killings had a different architecture. They were neater, more considered, they accounted for more variables. What Helle described was something that had been building for years and had arrived on a stopped train in the Alps at a kind of threshold. He had received the letter from Miss Houtin, not knowing it was from her, and he had come onto the train with the intention that he had described to Poirot. The evidence, the exposure, the legal route. He had meant that. He had not boarded the train with a knife in his bag and murder in his heart. He wanted Poirot to understand this, and Poirot did understand it, though he also understood that it did not change what had happened. He had been in the corridor at 10 o'clock because he had gone to find Villiers. To see him, just to see him, he said, to stand near the man and make the thing real, because for 5 years Edmund Villiers had been an idea, a name, a cause, and Helle had wanted to see the actual human being before he decided anything. He had stood in the corridor, he had seen the woman leave, he had looked at the closed door of Compartment One, and then he had heard, through the door, voices, Villiers' voice, specifically, speaking to someone on the telephone in the compartment. A mobile telephone was a luxury almost no one had in 1952. Villiers naturally had one, and Villiers was speaking to someone, laughing in the particular way he had laughed. Helle had never heard it before, but recognised it immediately from the way Helena Marsh had described it that morning, and it was exactly as she had said, and saying clearly, audibly through the thin compartment door. Not remotely concerned. Let them come with their little papers. I've handled worse than 3 bitter investors and a guilty secretary. By the time we reach Zurich, it will all be... Helle stopped talking. He looked at the window. By the time we reach Zurich, he repeated quietly. That was what he said. It will all be handled by the time we reach Zurich. A pause. And I thought about my sister. I thought about what she had survived. Everything she had survived, the war. The years before the war. The things she had come through that would have broken most people entirely. And then this. This small, administrative cruelty. A man laughing on a telephone about people he had broken as though they were minor inconveniences. He stopped again. Poirot waited. I knocked on the door, Helle said. He opened it. He looked at me and he didn't know who I was. I was nobody to him, you understand. I was not even a face he would have known. I was one of hundreds of names on a list of investors. And he said, rather impatiently, yes, what is it? As though I were a porter who had come at an inconvenient time. A pause. I told him my name, Helle said. My full name and my sister's name. And I watched his face while I said it, and he made an effort. I could see him making the effort, sorting through whatever catalogue he kept of such things. And then he found it. I could see the moment he found it, and his expression did not change in the way I had thought it would. There was no guilt, no recognition of consequence. There was just a very slight recalibration. The way a man recalibrates when a meeting he thought was routine turns out to require a little more management. Helle's voice was entirely flat now. He said, I remember precisely. He said, Dr. Helle, I think we should talk. And he stepped back to let me in. Poirot closed his eyes for just a moment. He was not afraid, Poirot said. No, said Helle, he was not afraid. He sat down in his chair and he poured himself a brandy. He did not offer me one. And he looked at me with that face, that managed face. And he began to explain calmly the legal and financial reasons why what had happened in 1947 was not his responsibility, not in any actionable sense, and why any attempt to suggest otherwise would... He stopped. I had a scalpel in my jacket pocket, he said. I had carried it there for 3 days. I don't know entirely why. A doctor carries certain things from habit. I told myself it was habit. He looked at his hands, folded on his knees. It was not habit. The compartment was very quiet. He was still talking, Helle said. When it happened. He stopped talking quite quickly after that. He looked at me with... I have thought about this expression many times since last night, and I still cannot name it precisely. Not fear, not anger, something almost like surprise. As though, despite everything, he had not genuinely believed that actions have consequences until that precise moment. He fell silent. Outside, the mountains, the snow on the high peaks catching the light, very white, very still. "The brandy glass," Poirot said after a moment. "It fell." "He let it go," Hella said. "His hand just opened. It rolled to the corner. I looked at it for a moment. I don't know why." A pause. "Then I left. I wiped the door handle. I went back to my compartment. I sat on the edge of the bunk and I thought I would feel something different than I felt." "And what did you feel?" Poirot asked. He asked it quietly, without judgment, with the genuine curiosity of a man who has spent his life trying to understand the interior of events rather than just their exterior. Hella thought about this for a long moment. "Tired," he said. "Very tired. And sad. Not for him. I want to be honest about that. Not for him. Sad for my sister, perhaps. Sad that she was not, that she couldn't know, that it didn't help her in any way that I could feel." He paused. "And something else, something I am less comfortable saying." "Say it anyway," Poirot said. "Relieved," Hella said, quietly. "For a little while before I understood what it would mean, what would happen now. For a little while. Just relief. That he was gone. That he was simply gone from the world." He looked at Poirot directly. "I am not proud of that." "No," Poirot said. "But it is human." They sat in silence for a moment. Poirot was aware of the weight of what he was carrying, not just in this conversation, but in the whole morning, the whole night before it. 3 people damaged by one man's greed. A 4th who had spent 15 years carrying her guilt in a leather document case. And now this, a man who had done something terrible and knew it and was not pretending otherwise. He thought about justice. He thought about it carefully, and the way he always tried to think about it, not as an abstract principle, not as a legal mechanism, but as a human thing, flawed and imprecise and desperately important. He thought about the courts, a trial, evidence presented, the long machinery of the law grinding forward. He thought about what that would mean for Hella, for Mrs. Marsh, and Calder, who had known nothing of the killing itself, for Miss Houghton and her documents. He thought about Villiers, who had laughed on a telephone in a private compartment and been surprised at the very end to discover that consequences were real. And he thought, with the honesty he demanded of himself, the same honesty he demanded of everyone around him, about the small cold fact that Hercule Poirot was not the law. He was a man who helped the law, assisted it, directed it, but he was not it, which meant that the decision of what to do with what he knew was in the end his, and his alone, and he would have to make it and live with it, the way Hella would have to live with what he had done, the way Miss Houghton would have to live with 15 years of paperwork and small rebellions, the way Mrs. Marsh would live with the husband she had lost and the anger she'd carried, the way Calder would live with the friend he had not been able to save. All of them carrying things, all of them marked by one man's decision, 20 years ago, to value money over lives. Poirot was quiet for a long time. He gathered them all in the dining car at noon. All 4, Mrs. Marsh, Calder, Hella, Miss Houghton. Devereux stood at the far end of the car because Poirot had asked him to be present, for reasons he had not explained and Devereux had not pushed. The other passengers had been given breakfast and told the train would be moving within the hour. They had retreated mostly to their compartments, and with the slightly dazed relief of people who have spent a night at the scene of something dramatic and are now permitted to leave it behind. Poirot stood at the head of the long table. The 4 of them sat, not as they had at breakfast, watchful and separate, but differently now with the quality of people who have stopped performing distance and are simply present, tired, waiting. "I will tell you what I know," Poirot said, "and then I will tell you what I intend to do about it," he told them. And he told them about Miss Houghton's documents, and the unsigned letters, and the confrontation at 10 o'clock. He told them, briefly, without unnecessary detail, about Hella going into Compartment One, and why, and what had happened there. He told them about the letter he had found, and what it said, and the fact that Villiers had known or suspected all 4 of them. He told all of this plainly, without dramatic pause, without the theatrical revelation that some of his colleagues favoured, and that he himself had occasionally, he admitted, employed in the past. This did not seem like a moment for theatre. It seemed like a moment for plainness. When he finished, the dining car was very quiet. Mrs. Marsh was looking at Hella. Her expression was complex, not shock, something more like a deep, exhausted recognition, as though she had known on some level and was now simply acknowledging what she had known. Calder had his eyes closed. He was very still. Hella was looking at the table. Miss Houghton was looking at Poirot. "And now?" she said. "And now?" Poirot said, and paused. He thought briefly about a young woman in London in 1949 who had survived everything and had not survived this. He thought about a professor of economics who had not been the same man afterward. He thought about a young man at university who had trusted a friend and both of them had trusted the wrong investment and one of them had not recovered. He thought about justice. Again. Still. "Devereux," he said. The Capitaine looked up. "Monsieur Villiers died of a single stab wound," Poirot said. "From the position of the body and the angle of the wound, it is consistent with the self-inflicted injury. A man who was, perhaps, in poor health, under considerable stress, and facing exposure for crimes committed years ago," he paused. "It is also consistent with other explanations. But in the absence of a weapon..." He looked at Hella. Hella reached into his jacket pocket. He placed a scalpel, clean, the blade retracted, the handle wiped, on the table. Poirot looked at it. He looked at Devereux. He looked at the 4 people at the table. "In the absence of clear evidence to the contrary," Poirot said carefully, "and given that the deceased was a man facing imminent legal exposure for significant financial crimes, evidence of which exists in considerable documentation," he gestured toward Miss Houghton's leather case, "I think it is possible that this matter is not entirely straightforward, that it will require careful examination by the relevant authorities in Zurich." Another pause, during which time I would suggest that Miss Houghton's documents be preserved and made available to the appropriate legal parties. The crimes of 1947 did not die with Edmund Villiers. Others were involved. Others are accountable. Devereux looked at him for a long moment. "Monsieur Poirot," he said slowly, "are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting," Poirot said, "that justice is a wide river, and that the death of one man is sometimes a smaller tributary of a much larger matter." He held Devereux's gaze. "I am suggesting that the Zurich authorities will want to see those documents very much indeed. And I am suggesting that the circumstances of Monsieur Villiers' death are sufficiently ambiguous to warrant careful investigation rather than immediate conclusions." Devereux was quiet. Then slowly he nodded. It was not agreement exactly. It was the nod of a practical man who has understood what is being asked of him and has decided that the thing being asked is not, when examined closely, entirely unreasonable. The train began to move at 12:30. Poirot stood in the corridor and watched the small unmanned halt at Pontebella slide away behind them. The cracked platform, the 3-walled shelter, the single lamp on its post, all of it already half buried again in fresh snow that had begun falling softly as they got under way. In an hour it would be entirely covered. By tomorrow it would look like nowhere in particular, like a place where nothing had happened. He thought about that. He thought about how quickly the snow covered things, how indifferent it was, how it fell on the guilty and the innocent and the somewhere in between with exactly the same soft persistence. Mrs. Marsh came to stand beside him in the corridor. She did not speak for a moment. They stood together and watched the mountains. "Will it be enough," she said, "the documents, to do something about the others, the ones who helped him?" "I believe so," Poirot said. Miss Houghton is a thorough woman. She kept thorough records." A pause. "Charles would have—" She stopped. "He would have wanted to see it handled properly, through the law." "Yes," Poirot said. "I believe it will be." She nodded. She went back to her compartment. Calder found him in the dining car 20 minutes later, where Poirot had ordered coffee and was sitting with it and not drinking it, which was unlike him. "I want to ask you something," Calder said, sitting down across from him. "Ask." "What you said to Devereux, the ambiguity, the careful investigation." He paused. "Do you believe that? Or were you managing the situation?" Poirot looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he looked at Calder. "I believe," he said carefully, "that justice is not always best served by the most direct route. I believe that the death of one man, when examined within its full context, the lives he destroyed, the crimes that have gone unpunished for 20 years, this suffering that was entirely his making, presents what I would call a genuinely complex moral picture." He paused. "I also believe that Dr. Heller is a man who has spent his life trying to repair things, and who made, one night on a train, a decision that cannot be undone and that will be with him always. And I believe that adding a trial and a conviction to what he already carries would serve, not nothing, but considerably less than one might hope." Calder looked at him. "And if Villiers had been a different kind of man—" "Then I would have made a different decision," Poirot said. Simply, "I am not saying what Heller did was right. I am saying that what is right and what justice requires are not always identical, and that a man who has spent 40 years working with the law is permitted, at least once, to make that distinction for himself. Calder was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it." Poirot picked up his coffee, drank it. It was cold, which served him right for sitting with it too long. "Do not thank me," he said. "Go and live well. That is sufficient." He saw Heller once more before Zurich. The doctor was standing at the window at the end of the corridor, the same window, Poirot realised, where Miss Houghton had seen him standing at 10 o'clock the previous night, looking out at the mountains. Poirot stopped beside him. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, watching the Alps go past. The train was moving well now. In making up the time it had lost, the engine sounded steady and purposeful. "I want to say something," Heller said, "and I want to say it without—" He paused, "without asking for absolution. I'm not asking for that." "I know," Poirot said. "I would do it again," Heller said, very quietly. "I think I would. I don't say that proudly. I'm not. It is not a comfortable thing to know about oneself, but I think it is the truth." A pause. Does that matter to you? For what you have decided?" Poirot thought about this for a moment. "No," he said. "What you might do is a question for the future. What you did is a question for the past. I concern myself with what is in front of me." Heller nodded. They stood in silence for a little while longer. "Your sister," Poirot said. "Her name." "Martha," Heller said. Poirot nodded. "Martha," he repeated quietly, as though saying it meant something, which in some small way he believed it did. Names mattered. The named were not forgotten. Heller looked at the mountains. After a moment he said, "Thank you." Poirot did not say, "Do not thank me" this time. He simply nodded and moved on down the corridor and left the doctor to his mountains and his silence, and whatever he would carry forward from this night and this train and this cold December crossing. Zurich came into view at 2:30. The city lay below the final descent from the mountains, orderly, precise, the lake a flat grey mirror in the winter light, the buildings neat along its shore, clean, settled. The kind of city that suggested that things could in fact be managed properly, which was perhaps why so much money found its way there. Poirot stood at his compartment window and watched it approach. He thought about what he had done. He turned it over once more, carefully, the way he had turned everything over on this train, looking for the crack, the error, the thing he had not accounted for. He found several things he was not entirely comfortable with. He noted them. He did not dismiss them. He was not, he reflected, entirely certain he had done the right thing. But he was fairly certain, and here he allowed himself the small, precise warmth of a man who has, in the end, followed what he most deeply believed, that he had done a human thing, and that sometimes, when the right thing and the human thing were not quite the same, a man had to choose. And live with it, as everyone on this train would live with what they were carrying forward. The train pulled into Zurich Hauptbahnhof at 2:47, 7 hours and 10 minutes behind schedule, on a cold December afternoon with fresh snow beginning to fall again over the city. Hercule Poirot collected his bag. He straightened his coat. He adjusted his muffler. He walked off the train into the cold, clear air of Zurich, and he did not look back. Behind him, in the carriages, the others gathered their things and moved toward the doors, Mrs. Marsh with her single ring and her long patience, and the thing she had come for and had not quite gotten, but had gotten something adjacent. Calder with his restless hands and his friend's memory and perhaps now a version of an ending. Miss Houghton with her leather document case held close against her body, already thinking, Poirot suspected, about the calls she would make and the lawyers she would contact and the work that remained. And Heller, last of all, stepping off the train into the Zurich afternoon with the mountains still visible in the distance, and a name, Martha, that would not leave him, and that he did not, in truth, want to leave. The train sat in the station, patient and still. Snow settled on its roof, and the midnight train to Zurich gave up its last secret, which was, perhaps, that there had been no clean answer to be found inside it, only human beings, damaged and desperate and capable of both terrible and necessary things, trying to find their way through a dark that had no simple exits, which is, in the end, most of what any mystery ever contains.